I'm delighted to be with you again in a continuation of a series of lessons on evolution and spatial creation. And in this lesson, we're going to begin a critical examination of the arguments that are usually made by the evolutionists. I'm delighted by the opportunity to think with you about things that are divine. Those who believe the Bible believe that this universe manifests on every hand evidence of God's existence. Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork. People who are Christians are people who can be called a people of faith, but many times people misunderstand what faith is. Faith is not a leap in the dark by the light of the moon. That's marriage, not biblical faith. Biblical faith is a conviction which is the result of evidence that has been brought to us. We believe the Bible to be the Word of God because we believe that there are sufficient, strong evidence to convince us that the book, the Bible, has been written or delivered or given by God to man. And we believe that faith that we have in God and in His Word is based upon strong evidences, and the idea that the universe itself is the product of divine activity and that you and I, each of us, are the result of God's creative activities. This is a matter of faith to us, but there's a lot of evidences that we want to bring forth to show you why we believe that. Let me just suggest to you that it does us all good to spend some time thinking about God. God has an intense interest in this planet. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 9, when Jesus was giving the example of the model prayer, He said, "Our Father, which art in heaven." God is in heaven, but He's interested in what's going on in this planet so that we're even privileged to talk to Him about things that are going on in this planet. The Bible shows us that each of us, as in Acts chapter 17, each of us are what we are because God has made us this way. And we will say that in Him we live and move and have our very being. And it does us good to think about God. Secondly, God is a being of purpose. In the first chapter of the book of Ephesians, verses 9 through 13, Paul talks about the plan that God had for man. And it said He did these things according to the good pleasure of His own will. God planned His work and worked His plan. The very word purpose means to put something up before you, and then to go ahead and do that very thing. And so a discussion of God and thinking about God, and especially in the themes that we've been thinking about, is to show that there's meaning and purpose to the human existence. And thirdly, God is approachable. The Bible does not talk about God as some great being who put all those gorgeous galaxies that well us out there spinning in their orbs and then went off and left it. But He's approachable, and He wants to have a personal relationship with us. And passage after passage in the Bible emphasizes that very thing. So God is not an absentee landlord. He's concerned about what's going on here tonight in this place. He's involved in human history. And we can have a personal relationship with God, and that's encouraging to me. It does us good to think about God. In fact, the future of the world does not lie in outer space. It lies in the space between my ears and your ears. What you think about who you are, and what is the purpose of life? And what's the destiny of all of us who are living and breathing and thinking? Yes, it does us good to think about God. One of the in-philosophers of the 20th century is Ludwig Wittgenstein, and wrote the famous Logical Tractatus. And you cannot find the answer to the world within the world. You cannot find what it's all about within the world. And you know, Christians would believe or agree with that the ultimate explanation and understanding of the world must come from without the world. And that's exactly what we believe the Bible is. It is a revelation from the maker of the world to those who are in the world to help them to better understand it. And the truth of the matter is, if you're going to see the truth, you're going to have to look where it must be found. You remember when people were looking for Halley's Comet? That was a big thing, and people were going out at night looking for Halley's Comet. And people make jokes about that people were going out in the same park, and some looking in this direction, some looking over here, some looking over here, and each of them say, "I see it, I see it." What you soon discovered was there are millions of places where Halley's Comet is not. If you want to see Halley's Comet, you have to look exactly where it is. And if you want to see what the truth is, you're going exactly where it is. Christians believe that the ultimate explanation of the universe is found in the Bible. And though we encourage and enhance the sciences, there are inherent limitations in the scientific method that we've already spoken about. And that's why we're very concerned about what's going on in the education of our children in the public schools. Back in 1925, when Clarence Darrow was a part of the famous Coates trial, in which a law was being tested, a law in the state of Tennessee that forbid people teaching the theory of evolution. This is kind of matched today by attempts to balance the teaching in school and say, why not let students have an opportunity to look at several sides of an issue? But Darrow said it is bigotry for public schools to teach only one theory of origins. What would he say about the times in which we're now living? That would interest me. Oftentimes when I go over the country and I go to high schools and colleges and universities, and I'll be interviewed by people and they're trying to do, Mr. Clark, are you trying to introduce religion into the public schools? And my response is, no, that's not what I'm trying to do, but what I'm trying to do is this, is to support the idea that when students are introduced to a theory, an idea, or a concept, they're much better educated students if they hear the best arguments for and against the theories and the ideas and concepts. And if there are good, strong, solid scientific reasons to believe in the concept of special creation, then why shouldn't students hear those? And if there are good, strong scientific reasons to question the theory of evolution, why should they not have an opportunity to hear those things? And those are the real things that we've been talking about. And so in this series, why the theory of evolution has not been proven. We've been dealing with that. And what I want to try to do right here is to set the tone and the stage for this, as I have every evening, by saying to you what I'm really talking about. We need to define our terms. When we're talking about the theory of evolution, we're not talking about just change and development. Everything. One woman one time said, I'm not what I ought to be, and I'm not what I, am going to be, but anyway, I ain't what I was. Well, we're all changing. Change is all around us. We're not arguing whether or not the world of living things evidences change. We've really made the point that if you understand this whole controversy, you must make a definition and a distinction between the special and the general theories of evolution. The special theory is that changes take place within groups of living things, and these are provable. By experimentation and observation, we can see variations and changes within groups of living things. But what we're really quarreling with and arguing with and saying not only the Bible confronts this, but also the scientific evidence confronts it, that one major group of living things develops into another, to another, and to another, until you have this concept right here. This is the concept of the general theory of evolution. And that is that all living forms in the world are interrelated to one another. And you can unprocess, they say, by talking about life came from the non-living, it happened only one time. And that animal life is developed from the marine to the amphibian, to the reptiles, to birds and mammals, and finally man. And this is what you find on the geological time scale. This is the general theory of evolution. We are not quarreling, if you please, with change and development within groups. The Bible teaches not fixity of species, but fixity of kind. It teaches that God made groups of living things, but there's not a problem about change and development within groups. The problem comes from one group to another, to another, to another. Scientific evidence supports the special. It does not support the general theory. To put it in maybe clear language once more, the special, which can be called microevolution, is changes within groups. The general theory of evolution is macroevolution, changes from one major group to another group. That's what we're discussing. And the reason why we want to make that distinction is because invariably when people start trying to, quote, prove evolution, they go to instances or evidences which do not prove the general theory at all. What these things do is establish the concept of the special theory. Well, now, if there are changes within groups, why can't you say that there are changes outside of the groups and between the major groups? And the point is, if the evidence was there, you could say that. The evidence is not there, and we hope to show that this evening. But the picture of the horse, the development of the horse, is simply proof of changes within groups. So is the changes that took place among the finches on the Galapagos Islands. It simply sustains the idea that there are changes within groups. And even with artificial mutations of Drosophila, the fruit fly, that's just simply an example of changes within groups. That's not sustaining the concept of the general theory at all. And whenever someone comes up and says, oh, here's proof of evolution, ask yourself this question: what's being established in that? Let me give an example. In England, It was a study made of moths, peppered moths, and during the Industrial Revolution, and as a result of the pollution and the soot all over the buildings, whenever these moths came forth, there were light ones and dark ones and peppered ones. And what ones do you think survived? Well, those that were very light colored, birds came down and picked them off very easily. And so what happened is you had a shift in color. You had a shift in color toward the dark end. And this is what is meant by the survival of the fittest or natural selection. Both of those expressions do describe things that take place in nature. The reason why those that were darker were able to survive was because their color enabled them to be hidden, and hence they were able to live, and then they were able to produce offspring. You have in this, which is called industrial melanism, is a shift in color. All that establishes is the special theory of evolution. What we're looking for is evidence of major groups of animals developing one into another into another. That distinction is so important. Now, in our approach to the matter of the arguments made by the evolutionists, what we've been doing is showing that the difference to be made as we study the evidence is not over the evidence, but the interpretation of the evidence. You see, the creationist is not somebody that's blinded to the reality of the world around us. We look at the rock formations and know that there you have the science of geology. We look at living things, and we want to look at the evidence. But the problem is that too many times what people are hearing is the evolutionary interpretation of a body of evidence. The evidence is neutral, but what you have are interpretations of that evidence. And we want to show the distinction that needs to be made. It's not over the evidence, but over the interpretation of the evidence. Now let me go a little bit further and show what I'm talking about here. The requirements of a proof. In order for a theory to stand and be accepted widely, two things are essential. You must be able to explain the data that's gathered by experimentation and observation. You've got to be able to explain the information that you have by your theory. But that is not enough. That one thing is not enough to sustain the theory. You must also be able to exclude any alternatives. I used in a previous lesson the idea of a black eye. If I came in here with a black eye, everybody could see it. That would be evidence he's got a black eye. But if I explained to you that I got the black eye because I ran into a door, but you had pretty good information that what had happened, I got in an argument with my wife and she hit me, these nations can account for the black eye. The question is, which one is right? And the fact of the matter, just because you could explain some information would not prove that your explanation is true. This is the whole thing about detective stories. You might have a neat little theory that can account for all the evidence, but it's dead wrong. And so what we want to show you is that when you're studying the whole area of evolution, you need to look at what are the real evidences. And then notice that what we're discussing here is not evidences as much as interpretation of evidence. And let me illustrate, if I may. There are 6 areas that we frequently talk about: comparative morphology and physiology, vestigial organs, genetics, paleontology or study of fossils, fossil man, and the age of the earth. And what I hope to illustrate is that the real problem here is not over evidence, but over interpretation of the evidence. To make it just a little clearer here, just notice with me, if you will. The real issue is not over evidence, but over the interpretation of the evidence. Now let's take these and quickly note them, and then get down to the real question we want to deal with tonight, and that is the subject of geology. Let's take, for instance, the area of comparative morphology and physiology. What's really being argued here is that living things are very much alike. Now we can argue, of course, that there are differences between living things. And there are great differences between living things. But in many ways, living things are fundamentally very much alike. And when we look at this uniform genetic code among living things, when we look at the fact that fundamentally, in many ways, living things are very much alike. For instance, all animals are alike in being composed of protoplasm organized as cells. Now, if living things are very much alike, how do you explain that they're very much alike? Well, the evolutionist says that the only way that you can explain the fact that living things are very much alike, that one evolved from the other. And then they go further and say that if you were going to talk about a creator would have had to make everything different. Well, why would he? if you wanted to make a world like the one we're living in. Now look for a moment at the fact of the web of life, the food chain. We have animals feeding upon other animals and animals upon plants. And in view of this web of life in the food chain, you can understand the need for things to be very much alike. For instance, if I take an egg out of a chicken and have a nice fried egg, and I take some bacon out of a pig, how is it that I can take something that came out of a chicken and something that came out of a pig and put it in me? Because I can utilize the amino acids that are found in both of those. And the fact of the matter is that when living things are seen to be very much alike, the only possible explanation is not the evolutionary explanation. In fact, the creationist point of view is clearly, easily a scientific, which the evolutionists would want to make, and really in a better sense explains the situation. That an all-wise creator makes living things which are very much fundamentally alike. The issue is not over evidence, the issue is over interpretation of evidence. Well, let's take another example, if you will. Let's take vestigial organs. Now here's the evidence. Structures which are usually without apparent function are termed vestigial. Now they'll talk about functionless organs in a number of living things. Get it on here right. And they'll talk about organs in various living things that are said to be without a function. But since man is the most studied of all animals, and this picture was made on a cloudy day, but there are 5 to 9 organs in the human body that usually they talk about as being vestigial. Now you'll notice that one of these is called an appendix. I remember many years ago talking on this, and there was a medical doctor, and right in the middle of my lecture, he just offered some information and pointed out that at that time the journals had shown that they had determined that the vermiform appendix produced lymphoid tissue. They didn't know everything about it and all the aspects of it, but it was not without a function. The appendix does have a function. But the argument runs like this. That is that there are organs in the human body that have no apparent function. Now, apparent is very important here. It's not that they don't have any function, it's just that we don't know what it is. Now, the evolutionists would make the argument that if you have organs in the body that have no function, well, that's just proof that man's body has undergone an evolution, so at some time in the past, it did have a function, but now it doesn't. Well, the response that the creationists would give to that is that the basic assumption being made by the evolutionists is that we know everything about the human body, and therefore we can conclude that this does not have a function. Folks, at one time, there was a German anatomist, Wiedersheim, that had a list of 180 vestigial organs in the human body. We were walking museums. Well, what happened? As our knowledge of the human body increased, our list of vestigial organs diminished. The greatest mystery in the universe today is not out there, but it's in here. It's in our brain. That's the greatest mystery. We don't know everything that we will know about the human body now. But there's another point to be made here, and that is that there's a violation of a fundamental rule in biology in making the vestigial organs argument. There are these organs in our body which, like for instance a man, may come from the same spot in the embryo as, for instance, the wings of a bird. But they don't have the same function. I tried it when I was a little boy, getting out and getting on a shed and jumping off and thinking that my arms had the same function, but they don't. And what you find out here is that though these organs may come from the same spot, they do not necessarily have the same function. And what they're really basically arguing is they go back and find a pig, and if a pig has an appendix, and we know that what it does, it breaks down cellulose tissue, but we come over here with man, haven't got this figured out yet, that there's an attempt made to make an identification between the two. And that's a violation of a rule in biology that because they come from the same place in the embryo, that does not mean that they have the same function. You see, the issue is not over the evidence. It's over the interpretation of the evidence. We don't know everything we'll ever know about the human body so that we have a right to say that these organs are without function. They do have a function, but it's not apparent to us. Notice the difference then between the argument that would be made by the creationists and the evolutionists. It's not over the evidence, but it's over the interpretation. Now, another argument that's made has to do with the area of genetics. Among animals that reproduce sexually, no two save identical twins are exactly alike. The individuals of every species vary in size, proportion, coloration, external, internal structures, physiology, and habits. Now, the argument from genetics is this, that since in living things the descendants are slightly different than the parents, and they are. Now, of course, with me, they've always checked over our children to see, first of all, if they have little beady eyes, And then for the Clark toe, there's a toe that I have, and we check and see, well, does this child have it? This is what's involved in heredity. Someone said heredity is what causes people to look at the other side of the family with suspicion when their children become teenagers. But the argument from genetics is this. Since there are slight variations between each generation, if you got enough of these together over a long enough period of time, that would be enough for all the changes essential, or the stuff of change to account for all of the evolutionary development. Well, this goes back to what we were talking about, the special and the general theories. See, when you carefully study the science of genetics, you'll understand that there are changes and variations within the living things, but these are always limited. They are not unlimited. There are changes within groups, but we do not have a magnitude of change observable and provable in nature of one major group to another. Now, I remember the school teacher in a high school situation that said to me one time, Mr. Clark, theoretically, if you changed an amoeba enough, couldn't you get an elephant? And I said, theoretically, you can get anything, but tell the students who are learning how to become scientists, if on the basis of experimentation and observation we've ever seen that kind of change. And I knew what he was going to say. He said, well, of course, because it takes too long. See, he was saying it takes millions of years. And that's the reason why, in a case or do or die, it's to the geological record that we must fly. Because the geological record purports to be a record of millions of years in the past. And if you're going to make your case for evolution, the one place that you have direct evidence that you would go to is to the geological record. And that's where we're going to go tonight to talk about what I believe is one of the most important things to consider. The science of geology. It's interesting to me to drive down the highways and look out and just see rock formations. You cut a superhighway down here and you'll just sort of have a primary course in geology. And someone has said that geologists, they dig the earth the most. Agatha Christie, who was a famous mystery story writer, said that the ideal is an archaeologist because the older you get, the more interest he takes in you. She was married to an archaeologist. But you see, geologists and archaeologists study old things. And there's interest in how old is the earth. We want to talk about geology, the rock record, the theory of evolution, and whether or not the science of geology sustains the evolutionary claims. And when we're studying about geology, there are two kinds, there's physical and historical, and we're interested in historical geology because that is developed from the record of living forms that have been preserved. They're basically these kinds of formations in fossils: preservation of the actual remains, molds and casts and imprints, and replacement by mineral matter such as petrified wood. And go with me now and let's take a close-up look. This is the geological time scale, which they say on the basis of the study of the fossils they've been able to produce this. And in this case it takes both of them. On this particular presentation of it, to put it here. But it purports to be a picture of the development life from marine forms to amphibian to reptile to birds and mammals and finally man. We're going to talk tonight about the science of geology in two words right up front here that are essential to understand the history of the development of geological thought: catastrophism and uniformitarianism. These two ideas warred with one another in the 19th century when the science of geology was pretty strongly developed under the influence of several. Now what we're going to show, as we said earlier, that the issue being discussed is not over evidence but over interpretation of evidence. There are rock formations out there. Everybody can see them. They are real and they exist. But what is the best explanation of how they got there? Were these rock formations laid down slowly and gradually over a very long period of time? Or were they put there as a result of tremendous forces working rapidly over a short period of time? That's the conflict, or the discussion between catastrophism and uniformitarianism. And in order to understand this, you need to have a little history lesson as to how the geological time scale was developed. Now here is a picture of where we're going now. This print's very small, so we're going to enlarge it for you, but we're going to follow here how the modern geological time scale was developed. This is going to be a lesson in history. A fellow was talking about he and his wife and said every time we get in an argument, she gets historical. And the fellow said, "You mean hysterical, don't you?" He said, "No, she gets historical. She always brings up the past." Well, we got to bring up the past here in order to understand it. Not going to get hysterical about it, but we want to get historical here. And let's study how the geological time scale was developed. We go to Charles Lyell, who's really the father of modern geology in many ways. Sir Charles Lyell held that the earth changes were gradual, taking place at the same uniform slowness that they are today. Lyell is credited with the propagation of the premise that has guided geologic thought ever since, namely the present is the key to the past. What he postulated is if you want to know what happened in the past, you look at the present. And pushing it all the way to the wall, you say that nothing happened in the past that's not going on today. Of course, that would mean you would just by postulating it, deny that there had ever been anything such as the Genesis flood. A flood of magnitude as to be not seen at all today. And so this is called the doctrine of uniformitarianism, and it's very important to notice that it's called a doctrine. It's a basic assumption in thinking and in interpreting the data that is gathered. Uniformitarianism is the concept that there's a uniformity in nature to the extent that if you want to know what happened in the past, you look at what's happening today, and you say that nothing happened in the past that's not going on today. Uniformitarianism. Now that was in contrast with many who in the 19th century pointed to the fact that in order to explain the geological record, you had to appeal to great catastrophes that had happened before. Now, Charles Lyell had a great deal of influence upon Charles Darwin. Darwin made a 5-year voyage around the world when he was in his 20s. The voyage of the Beagle. And he had Lyell's book with him when he made that journey. Here's a picture of Darwin, just a young man, and here's another picture of Charles Lyell. We usually think about Darwin as the man with a beard, but as a result of that journey, the basic thinking of Charles Darwin began to be hammered out. Because what he did, he accepted some ideas, some arguments that Lyell made. Darwin was greatly influenced by Lyell and the doctrine of uniformitarianism. There can be little doubt that it was through Lyell's principles that Darwin's mind was emancipated from the shackles of biblical chronology. Now what Lyell taught was that the best way to understand the geologic work out there is that slow, gradual forces over a very long period of time put the rocks down there. What Darwin does, he takes that same kind of thinking and applies it to the realm of biology. But remember, that's a doctrine. That's something assumed. And in the assumption, they therefore interpreted the evidence in that way. Now it says that had this step not taken place, that is, that he had not accepted Lyell's principles, it seems unlikely that the origin of species could ever have fermented out of the voyage of the Beagle, for Darwin's theory of evolution required for its foundation far more historical time than even the uniformitarian geologists were accustomed to conceiving. You can see, if you'll read the voyage of the Beagle, that Darwin was accepting this idea of uniformitarianism, despite some things that looked to the contrary to him. This is a statement that he made. What then has exterminated so many species and whole genera? He looked at some fossil graveyards, millions of these things buried together. The mind is at first irresistibly hurried into the belief of some great catastrophe. Well, why not accept that? But thus to destroy animals from both large and small in southern Patagonia and Brazil, or in the Cordillera of Peru, in North America up to the Bering Straits, we must shake the entire framework of the globe. Well, why don't you believe that? Why don't you accept that? Because he'd already postulated it couldn't take place. Since the entire framework of the globe is not being shaken today, it couldn't have been shaken in the past. And so he accepted the assumptions of Lyell. Now, what's an assumption? We haven't got all the evidence yet. Like the woman who came down to Texas from Chicago, and she asked a rancher out there why this cow out there didn't have horns. He was very patient with her. He said, now, it doesn't have horns because, well, sometimes we breed them that way, sometimes they're born that way, and sometime after they're born we cut them off. But the reason why that one doesn't have horns is that it's a horse. Well, we understand then when we're talking about assumptions. He assumed the thing that had not been proven. And the result of that, the theory of evolution, the theory that all living things, extant and extinct, are the result of forces of change and variation working slowly over a very long period of time. Simple forms have developed into very complex forms. Man is the product of all this. Man, as Darwin wrote, thus we have given to man a pedigree of prodigious length, but not, it may be said, of noble quality. He was saying, of course, that we were derived from the lower animals. So in order to understand how we got to where we are today is that it's not an issue of the rock formations. They exist out there. But the question is, how did they get there? And many accepted the idea that they got there by slow, gradual forces working over a long period of time. And hence, the evidence is interpreted in that way. And here's how the modern geological time scale was developed. First of all, accepting evolution is a proven fact. You know, high school teachers say to their students, well, if you just lay it all out on the table, students, it screams evolution. Question, how did you lay it on the table? You see, if you take your evidence and interpret your evidence on the basis of certain presuppositions, that's why your arrangement tends to prove it, because you arrange them that way in the first place. And so the geological time scale is a result of accepting evolution as proven. To the geologist, evolution is a fact, not a theory, but not all of the causes of evolution are known. That's Richard Pearl. In the Barnes & Noble College Outline book, and those Barnes & Noble College Outline books, they usually take 15 or 20 representative texts and they sort of condense them down and show you basically what they're arguing. And so that's pretty representative of what you'd find in many texts on geology. And secondly, using the fossils. Without fossils, the details of geologic history could never have been pieced together. So we assume that evolution has occurred. You take the fossils and then you use the doctrine of uniformitarianism. Slow, gradual forces working over a long period of time. Detailed study of sedimentary rocks provide the clues to their origin, and by doctrine of uniformitarianism, what you can do is you can reconstruct the whole picture, they say. What you find then is the geological time scale is something that's been put together on paper, folks. And I want to examine it and show you the problems that were inherent in it when it was first developed and that have never really changed. And to show you that you do not have proof of evolution in the geological record. When you look at the geological time scale, and this writing is pretty small here, we'll have some larger ones in a moment, but this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, a widely used information source. And in 1957, Rastell said in his article, it cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical standpoint, the geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative age of the rocks are determined by the remains of the organisms that they contain. Dating the layers of rocks by the organisms that have been preserved, and then on the other hand turning around and dating the things that are preserved by the rock formations. And here's what your geologists will tell you about this. Ronald West of Kansas University has pointed out, contrary to what most scientists write, the fossil record does not support the Darwinian theory of evolution, because it is this theory, and there are several, which we use to interpret the fossil record. By doing so, we are guilty of circular reasoning if we say that the fossil record supports the theory. But the danger of circularity is still present, says David B. Kitts, who formerly taught at the University of Oklahoma. For most biologists, the strongest reason for accepting the evolutionary hypothesis is their acceptance of some theory that entails it. There's another difficulty. The temporal ordering of events beyond the local sections may critically involve paleontological correlation, which necessarily presupposes the non-repeatability of the organic events in geologic history. What he's saying here is that how do we have a right to take something from way over in that part of the globe and over here and put them together and correlate them? And you see, you don't dig down and find these rock formations all in one place. If you did, it would be 100 miles thick. What we have here is circular reasoning and also some assumptions which really ought to be seriously questioned, and geologists recognize that. And listen to what Derek Yeager said. Derek Yeager wrote a very important book called The Nature of the Fossil. Well, this is an article, but he wrote a book called The Nature of the Stratigraphical Record, and this is a quotation from an article that he wrote. He was the past president of the Royal Geological Society in England, and Derek Yeager said, "We all know that many apparent evolutionary bursts are nothing more than the brainstorms on the part of particular paleontologists. One splitter in a library can do far more than millions of years of genetic mutation." He's trying to get us to understand how it is that we tend to be reasoning in the circle. Now, we come back to Darwin now, and let me notice something with you. Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and this cover on a recent magazine a few years ago reminds us of the significance of Darwin and how his name keeps coming up. But Darwin admitted something with regard to his theory that related to the matter of geology. And listen to what Darwin admitted. He said, "Geology assured it does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection that can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record." Over 125 years ago, Darwin said that we do not have a graduated chain. What he was saying is we don't have missing links. We do not have a record of gradual development from one form to the other. It does not exist. That's what he said 125 years ago. He had something else. One of the problems that we have in the theory of evolution is that the earliest stage in this is supposed to be called the Precambrian. But the problem is the absence of the requisite fossils in the Precambrian. In their putting together the geological time scale, they'll start with the Cambrian, and here are highly developed forms. And the problem, though, is if life came from the non-living and it gradually developed, why don't we have them in the Precambrian? And the explanations that are given are never satisfying. And there have never really been any undisputed Precambrian fossils. People talk about, we found Precambrian fossils in Australia and some in South Africa and up in Canada, but all of them are always disputed. So what did Darwin say about this? To the question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods, he's talking about the Precambrian, he says, "I can give no satisfactory answer." He didn't have for it. Now what's happened in 125 years? Number one, do we have the intermediate fossils which would be necessary? If there has been slow, gradual development over millions of years, there ought to be a record of that kind of development in the rock record. And secondly, what about the absence of Precambrian fossils? Here is a statement about this matter of the absence of Precambrian fossils from Kay and Colbert in their book Stratigraphy and Life History. The introduction of a variety of organisms in the earliest Cambrian, including such complex forms as the arthropods or as the trilobites, is surprising. The introduction of abundant organisms in the record would not be so surprising if they were simple. The ancestors of the Cambrian fossils must have lived in some place if they evolved over a long span of time. Life of the Cambrian is known from the fossils of many kinds found in widely scattered parts of the earth, whereas the records and the earliest rocks are sparse and If there has been evolution of life, the absence of the requisite fossils in the rocks older than the Cambrian is puzzling. Those two things that Darwin himself suggested 125 years ago were problems in the theory, have not been resolved. The point of the matter is that we do not have gradualism in the record. We do not have missing links. They are not there. Let me just sustain what I just said to you. Here's David B. Kitts again. And he says, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. They are not there. And now it's being admitted that they haven't been there for 125 years. There was an interesting broadcast, which is a program produced by the public television station in Boston. And this was called, Did Darwin Get It Wrong? Did Darwin Get It Wrong? And interviewed in that was Niles Eldredge. Niles Eldredge. Now notice, Niles Eldredge is quoted here on this overhead. The pattern that we were told to find for the last 120 years does not exist. Countless textbooks have argued that we have in the geological record this chain that allows us to conceive that there has been this development of all forms of life, and it does not exist. And Niles Eldredge of the American Museum admits it, and he was interviewed on this program, and notice what he said. It is indeed a very curious state of affairs, I think, that paleontologists have been insisting that their record is consistent with slow, steady, gradual evolution, where I think that privately they've known for over 100 years that such is not the case. I view stasis and the trumpetsis to the whole world that the fossil record shows slow, steady, continuous change as opposed to the herky-jerky patterns of change as something akin to the emperor's new clothes. Paleontologists have known this for over 100 years. It is the only reason why they can correlate rocks with their fossils, for instance. Paleontologists, instead of then saying, well, Darwin was at least not correct as far as this particular formation was concerned, have tended to do other things. They have ignored the question completely. Does geology then prove this idea that one major group of animals developed? No, it isn't there. They don't have the intermediate fossils. Now, oftentimes they'll try to claim that they'll bring up the case of Archaeopteryx, who is supposed to be a flying reptile. And they'll try to claim that here's an intermediate form. Now they admit, according to their dating methods, which we're going to talk about in a later lesson, but according to their dating methods, they have birds that antedate Archaeopteryx by 50 million years. He's hardly an intermediate form. And feathers are a highly developed organism anyway, and those who argue for evolution will tell you that you don't have an intermediate form if you have a specialized organism. And they'll come up and say, well, this has got to be unique because there are claws on the wings, and therefore it's a flying reptile. Well, we've got 3 birds alive today that have claws on the wings. And they're certainly not an intermediate form. The point we're making is that the evolutionary theory is not sustained by the geological information. But what do men like Niles Eldredge and men like Stephen Jay Gould do? They want to maintain their belief in evolution, so what they do, they reinterpret the geologic history, and they've come up with what's called punctuated equilibrium. Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University and Niles Eldredge that we just quoted. And what they're saying, well, so what that we don't have these slow, gradual changes? What they claim now is that all of a sudden, radically and immediately and completely, an organism has changed. Back in 1940, Richard Goldschmidt postulated what was called hopeful monsters. Not have birds coming immediately out of reptiles. But why are they having to do this? Why are they having to come up with punctuated equilibrium? Because they do not have the essential information or the evidence in the rock record to sustain the position that they want to hold. There are a lot of things that do not fit their interpretation of the geological record. And I have a lot of these. I'm only able to show just a few of these. But the concept that things have gone on in the past just like they've gone on today are questioned by a sudden change in temperature. The riddle of the quick frozen mammoths, and this is a drawing or a diagram of these woolly mammoths that were found in Russia. When they thawed out, dogs ate their flesh without an ill effect. You women know that if you're going to freeze something so it can be later used and it's edible, it has to be done very rapidly. And they went to the frozen food industry and determined it would take 150 degrees below zero. The radical change in temperature, we don't know that today. That's not something going on. There's something that happened in the past that's not going on today. And if you believe the Bible, the concept of a biblical flood in which God brings judgment to the entire framework of the globe is certainly different than that. The point that we're making here is there's evidence to question the idea of uniformitarianism, and we have also evidence of formations that are out of sequence. Over in Montana, the famous Lewis Overthrust, this should be 11 periods down and 500 million years older, but it's up on the top. But they have an explanation for that. They usually bring up what they call overthrusting. And what happens is upheaves the earth, you see, and then there's an overthrusting. And so that which was oldest is now up on top, and then they say it wears away. Now that's a pretty good explanation of some local situation, some limited thing. But this is something that's 350 miles long, 50 miles wide, and 6 miles thick. And it doesn't fit the concept of uniformitarianism. It fits more the idea of something of a great catastrophic nature. it simply does not fit their interpretation. Another thing is sequence that are out of order, misplaced fossils. For instance, we can show you a picture of a fossilized human sandal print. Misplaced fossils. A fossilized human sandal print together with a trilobite. Well, trilobites were supposed to be extinct millions of years before men ever came upon the scene. This is the written report of the consulting geologist who studied the find, went into the field to be able to identify that he actually found it where he found it. And the point of the matter is that these two being together in the same place at the same time is just not supposed to be. Or it could be presented with regard to human occupation of the geologic strata. And all of these here pointing to the fact that at different levels where man was not supposed to be at all, we have evidence of the existence of human beings in those particular periods of time. All those things need to be looked at, and we need to see that the argument that the geological record supports the concept of uniformitarianism or supports the idea that forms of life that develop one from another just won't get it. Another thing that we turn to is what's called polystrate fossils. Now you're told that a layer of rock, it would take 1 million years or so for it to form. Millions and millions and millions and millions of years. But when you go and find polystrate fossils, that is a tree 20 or 30 feet long sticking up through all of these. The better explanation is that thing was put there rapidly, buried rapidly, so as to preserve the remains. Or out in Lompoc, California, there's a whale, an 80-foot long whale in an upright situation to tell me that it took millions of years for this to be put down. The better explanation is that it was deposited rapidly so that it could be buried and preserved or fossilized. That's a much better explanation. What we're saying tonight is the geological record does not sustain the evolutionary argument. But I want to move and talk a little bit about fossil men tonight too. How do they come up with this neatly graduated picture here of fossil men? Now you may have got these things in the newspapers, and they come and they advertise these things like this. Fossil men. How do they come up with this graduated series here? What they do is they take the fossilized remains that they find and they put them in a framework in which they assume that evolution has occurred. What they do is they take and come up with what we'd call an operational. They take living hominidae men and they take the parts of men that will fossilize their bones. And then they take living pongidae apes and those that will fossilize, and then they take those parts that will not overlap and they say this is a man and this is an ape, and whenever they find any remains, they put it somewhere between men and apes under the assumption that, of course, evolution has taken place. Now, as we talk about this procedure, let me go back and look at this again. I remember one time asking an anthropologist, I asked him, how do you know what this one looked like, or this one here, how do you know what this one looked like? He said, well, it's easy. If you know what this one looked like, the one behind it, and you know what this one looked like, the one in front of it, you'll know what this one looked like. And I wasn't overly impressed with that response. But let's talk about reconstructions like these. What should we say about reconstructions? Can we trust constructions? Let me give an example. Go to the Time Life book, the Emergence of Man series, and this is the Neanderthal book. And I've just lifted this out of here. Now what they did is they paid an artist to take a Neanderthal skull and put on the same skull the face of a man and that of a chimpanzee. The point that we're making is that we've been led to accept certain reconstructions, diorama figures in museums, which are misrepresentations. Now, let me read to you what it says in this book about the different faces that can fit the skull. How could early reconstructions of Neanderthal man's appearance have been so wrong? See, the picture of Neanderthal is beetle-browed, bovine and crude-looking. That's the popular picture that was presented of Neanderthal man. But now they're saying those were wrong, and is today's accepted version of the truth indeed true? Nobody knows the answers to these. The point we're making is that these reconstructions themselves are misleading. And let's notice this also. Now here are 3 Neanderthal reconstructions that were put in a museum, and they were there for many years. My children said that sort of reminds them of me before I shaved in the morning. But now, and I want to read again from this book. Typical of the misconceptions that have misled experts and laymen about Neanderthals are these diorama figures, a nursing mother and two tool-bearing men displayed in a Chicago museum for many decades. Their hunched shoulders, dangling arms, and ape-like postures are exaggerations at best. Most deceiving of all are their bovine expressions. Real Neanderthals were people of considerable intelligence. Now, when you talk about how they've reconstructed Neanderthal, there's been at least 9 different reconstructions. In other words, we need to listen to what Ernest Houghton of Harvard University said: trust not in reconstructions. You can, with equal facility, put on the same face or same skull the face of a philosopher and that of a chimpanzee. But the point is that the reconstructions are based upon the presuppositions that, of course, evolution has taken place. Now, this is what the latest position about what Neanderthal looked like. And you put some hair on him, and I've seen people look like that. But the point I'm making is that early on, when I've been discussing this thing for 20 years, in the past when I would discuss this, I'd have to go at great length to argue that the reconstructions were not right, they were misleading. Now they admit that they're not right, they admit that they're misleading. Another kind of reconstruction that you have is that of Zinjanthropus, and before they got through, they had at least 3 different reconstructions of Zinjanthropus, or the nutcracker man, that L.S.B. Leakey had found. Now why these kind instructions like this? How did this happen? And here's something that needs to be noted. This was Pierre Marcellin Boulez, was the early 20th century's foremost authority on fossils and traveled the world to study new finds. Yet he created a badly distorted reconstruction of Neanderthal that misled scientists for many years. Why? Because the popularization of the theory of evolution and the reconstruction of this fit perfectly into that which they were trying to do there. As I talk about fossils, we've seen tonight that the fossil record does not sustain the evolutionary claim. And I want you to see that when you and I look at the fossil men that they talk about today, how much data do we actually have? How much are we actually dealing with here? What are the omissions that are made with regard to their interpretation about fossil men? What's the history of the revision and reinterpretation and the evolution that's assumed to our thing? Let me first of all just show you some admissions that they are willing to make. David Pilbeam, who was one of the famous anthropologists of our time, he says, I know that at least in paleoanthropology that data are so sparse that theory heavily influences interpretations. Theories have in the past clearly reflected our current ideologies instead of the actual data. What he's saying is that it isn't the data that compels us to this picture of man, but our ideologies. We've accepted the evolutionary idea. Of course, man has been evolved from the lower animals according to the position they're taking. How much data are we actually dealing with here? How much data? The fossils that decorate our family tree are so scarce that there are still more scientists than specimens. The remarkable fact is that all the physical evidence we have for human evolution can still be placed with room to spare inside a single coffin or on the top of a pool table. Now, notice this statement in People of the Lake by Richard Leakey and Roger Lewin. And Richard Leakey was the famous son of a famous father, L.S.B. Leakey, and his mother, Leakey, who was equally skilled with his father. And Leakey searched, that is, L.S.B. Leakey searched for the missing link for 40 years in Africa. So we weren't surprised when every once in a while he said, I found it, after you've looked that long. Now, notice what they admit. Not only is there no single complete skeleton we can learn from, but we don't even have a big enough range of fossil fragments from which we can make up 100% fossil, a 100% identikit ancestor. In other words, we don't have a thing to put the whole thing together at all. He says if we were to try to piece together a kind of an ancestor, or skeleton of an ancestor, the fragments we have of our direct Homo ancestor of about 2 million years ago, the task wouldn't take very long simply because there are so few pieces to slot into place. The product would be pitifully incomplete: a skull, possibly part of an arm, a couple of leg bones, and perhaps half a foot bone and that's it. The real story of the so-called evolution of man begins with a creature, they say, that was on this earth 15 million years ago. We'll talk about the dating methods in the next lesson. But just for the sake of this, they tell us that the story of human prehistory is basically about the transformation of a small wood-like, ape-like creature, Ramapithecus, into a fully modern human. That's what the story is. If you trace the story as they present it today, they claim that you trace the roots 28 million years ago to Egyptopithecus and then Dryopithecus africanus and the Ramapithecus. Let me give you a picture of this creature that they claim is the ancestor of us all. Now here's Dryopithecus, but here's Ramapithecus, found in 1932 in India by a Yale student. 3 feet tall, found also in Africa. Leakey in 1961 found one. Fragments of the upper and lower jaws. There's been about 30 plus individuals found. Found in Greece and India and in Pakistan, Hungary, and in Africa. Now, here's the admissions that are made about this little creature, from which they try to make all these arguments that this is where the turn in the road took place and men were evolving into apes. Richard Leakey, he says, now to be absolutely honest, we have to admit we know nothing about Ramapithecus. We don't know what it looked like. We don't know what it did. We don't know how it did it. An interesting thing is that the investigation was carried on by Robert Eckert, a paleontologist from Penn State University. And the article about this was in Scientific American. And there was this drawing, this figure that accompanied it. And he was simply showing that within a single population here, the male, the female, and the infant, and the differences and variations that are there. And then what he did was he studied the difference between Dryopithecus and Ramapithecus, and he made 24 measurements on a collection of fossil teeth, and then he compared these with a range of variation within a living population of apes. And he found there was more variation within the living population of apes, both in the wilds in Africa and in the arrangement that they had a living center. There was more in a living population than there was between these two, Dryopithecus and Ramapithecus, which were supposed to be separated from one another by millions of years. And of course, I must rapidly close with what I think is devastation to their whole theory that this is the man, and return tomorrow night and finish the rest of the story with regard to how they at present time seek to arrange and explain for the development of fossil man, and show you every step of the way that it's a failure. But you see, to try to claim that this is a precursor of man on the basis of the tenuous evidence they offer is sad, because the argument they're making has to do with the teeth, with the jaw, how it functions. Now, when they first reconstructed it, they put the teeth like this together. They found these teeth, and see how that looks very much like the human. But that was until they, of course, found what? They found a full set of the teeth. And all you have to do is look at, here is the ape and here is the man. And this is what they found, but before they found it, they interpreted it so it looked like this. And they claim that it's the nature of the teeth, how they're set, and also how the jaw moves, that would say that it's a precursor of man. Devastation. There is in Ethiopia today, in the high altitude of that country, a baboon, Theropithecus gelata. And it has the small incisors and canines closely packed and heavily worn cheek teeth, powerful muscles, if you please, a short face. It is an ape. How in the world can you go back with his remains and, because of the nature of its teeth, claim that this was a precursor, and from that man developed when we have a living ape today? Our time forbids that we continue in this particular session with the matter of fossil men. We're going to complete that in the next session. And I appreciate so much your willingness to listen to me tonight as I've tried to deal with the question of whether or not the evidences that are around us, that are in the world of living things, that we're compelled to the evolutionary interpretation. What we've concluded that we are not. I thank you so much for your patient listening in this lesson.